Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. Today we're going to talk about how energy flows through ecosystems. So keep in mind that we get our energy from the food we eat. So today's lecture is going to focus on food webs and food chains. Also remember that we get our energy from macronutrients like carbohydrates, lipids, and proteins. When we eat a carbohydrate, you can immediately break that down for an energy source or store it in the body to be used later. Lipids or fats, once consumed, can be stored to be broken down for energy when we have no more sugars. And proteins, once consumed, go to the stomach and they are broken down into amino acids. And as they are broken down, we get energy from those proteins. It's about the same amount of energy that we would get from carbohydrates. However, keep in mind that once these amino acids are incorporated back into the body in muscles or enzymes, for example, it is very rare to break these proteins that we have built down for an energy source unless we're in dire circumstances like starvation, for example. If we're going to talk about how energy flows through ecosystems, we need to know what an ecosystem is. And ecosystems are interactions between biotic and abiotic factors. Bio means life, so biotic factors are living things. A means without, so abiotic factors are without life, so these are your non-living factors in the environment. And ecosystems come in a lot of different types. You can think about all of your major biomes would be examples of ecosystems. Your tropical rainforests, temperate rainforests, deserts, savannas, alpine forests, all of these are examples of biomes. And we can break these into three main types. You have your terrestrial or your land ecosystems, and then we have our aquatic or our freshwater ecosystems like lakes, rivers, and ponds, and we have our marine environments or our saltwater environments or ecosystems. So if we look here, we have a marine ecosystem, a tropical rainforest, and an alpine forest. And I want you to take just a minute and identify some of the biotic factors that would be in these different ecosystems. If you need more time, then you can pause. Hopefully, in the marine ecosystem, you saw the fish, and hopefully you remember that coral are also animals, so these would be biotic factors, and I'm sure there are some algae in there as well that would be biotic. In our tropical rainforest, you can see the plants, and those are our biotic factors. I'm sure there's going to be some animals running around in there as well. And in our alpine forest, you can see the plants, and other typical biotic factors include mosses, lichens, and then all of your animals that would live in these alpine environments. And now I want you to take just a minute to identify some of the abiotic factors you would see in these ecosystems. So if you need more time, then you can pause, but hopefully in our marine ecosystem, you notice the water, and the water would definitely be an abiotic factor. And there's also some things that you may not have thought about, like the salt and the minerals that's in the water, the pH and temperature of the water. These are non-living, but our biotic community really depends on these abiotic factors. If we look at our tropical rainforest, you can see the water in the background there. You also have air, that would be an abiotic factor, and sunlight, temperature, those would be, again, things that the living environment greatly depends on, but not alive themselves. If we look at our alpine environment, you see the sunlight, you see the glaciers here, you can see the rock, and these are abiotic factors, non-living factors, but your biotic factors really depend on these. Most ecosystems are going to get their energy from the sun. There are some examples of ecosystems that get energy from other places, but the majority of ecosystems are going to use sunlight as the main source of energy. And that sunlight is going to be captured by autotrophs. Auto means self and troph means feeder. So autotrophs are self-feeders, and these are typically going to be your plants. We also call plants producers because they make their own energy. Now, keep in mind that plants are making this glucose for themselves to break down for energy. It just so happens that we heterotrophs are able to use that glucose as we eat these plants. So once the plant, the autotroph, has made the energy, a heterotroph can then eat that food. So hetero means different and troph means feeder. So these are your animals and other organisms that are going to get their energy from the plants they eat. So heterotrophs are also called consumers because they must consume their food and they cannot make their own. If we look at some of these pictures over here, we have a passion flower, we have a thistle, we have grass. What kinds of organisms would these be? Hopefully you're thinking that they are autotrophs or producers, okay, because they're making their own energy, they're plants. But what about the bumblebee and the bison? What would we call those? Hopefully you're thinking heterotrophs, because they are not plants. They are animals and they're eating these plants, consuming these plants in order to get their energy. Most autotrophs use the process of photosynthesis to get their energy. Photo means light and syn means together, so photosynthesis is using light to put something together. Now there are some examples of autotrophs that can use another process that we're going to talk about here in just a few minutes, but most autotrophs, especially green plants, are going to use photosynthesis. And photosynthesis is taking radiant energy from the sun and turning it into a chemical compound called glucose that plants are able to store and use for energy later. And keep in mind, like we said, that plants make this glucose for themselves, and then it just so happens that we heterotrophs can use that as well. So sunlight is considered radiant energy because it travels through space as a wave, and these waves are part of the electromagnetic spectrum. Plants only use a small part of this electromagnetic spectrum, the visible part, and really out of the visible part, they're only using red and blue light. And there are studies that show you can grow a plant just using red and blue light. Now, if we're looking at photosynthesis, the reactants for photosynthesis are going to be your carbon dioxide and your water. So plants are going to take in this water, and this sunlight is going to provide the energy for these leaves to capture this carbon dioxide and put it together and make glucose. So glucose is a carbohydrate, and this is one of your products of photosynthesis. The other is going to be oxygen. So while most organisms, especially green plants, are going to use photosynthesis, there are some examples of organisms that can use chemosynthesis. This is a much rarer form of energy capture, but chemo for chemical and syn for together. So we're using chemicals to put something together. Now, most of the time, these organisms are going to use sulfur because sulfur has so many electrons that can be ripped away to provide energy for this organism. Now, we see these a lot around hydrothermal vents, and a hydrothermal vent is basically just an underwater volcano, and it's spewing out all of these compounds from inside of the earth. So there's a lot of bacteria and archaea down there that are capable of taking this sulfur out of the water and turning this into a chemical. And these bacteria and archaea are assumed to have been some of the first living organisms on the planet that were able to convert our atmosphere into what we have today. Now, I did want to give you an example of some organisms that can use chemosynthesis. So we see here these tube worms. This is all these little red and white things you see here are tube worms. This is a magnified picture of these, and some of these can get pretty long, up to about 2 meters long, so a little over 6 feet. So what happens is these tube worms don't actually have a mouth or a digestive system. Instead, they have this little area where bacteria live, and the bacteria are able to take the sulfur out of these vents that's coming from the earth and use those chemicals to make energy that these tube worms can then use to survive. Kind of neat. When we talk about producers and consumers, what we're talking about are trophic levels. And troph means to feed. So a trophic level is a feeding level or an organism's place in the food chain. And we give these trophic levels names. Now, the sun is not actually part of a trophic level, but it provides the energy for the first trophic level, which are your primary producers. These would be your autotrophs, like plants and chemosynthetic bacteria and archaea. The things that are going to eat the producers are called primary consumers or first level consumers. These will be your herbivores or things that are going to eat your plants. The primary consumers are eaten by secondary consumers, which are eaten by tertiary consumers, which are eaten by quaternary consumers, and then it all is going to end with decomposers. But trophic levels don't typically go above 5 levels. Energy runs out as it goes up a food chain, as we're going to see later. So there's just really not enough energy left after these quaternary consumers to support any higher levels. Now, organisms can participate at different levels of the food chain. So if you eat a cheeseburger with lettuce, tomato, and mayonnaise, for example, then you're going to be acting as a primary consumer when you eat the lettuce and the tomato, which are producers. And you're going to be acting as a secondary consumer when you eat the burger, which was a primary consumer, the cow, which ate the producer, the grass. So secondary consumers and higher are typically what we're going to think of as carnivores, but if an organism is a primary consumer and any of these other levels of consumers at the same time, then we would call that organism an omnivore. All food chains are going to end with decomposers. D means removal of, so decomposers are removing composition of matter. Usually it's going to be fungi and bacteria. Worms can also act as decomposers, but these are things that are going to obtain their energy from waste products of plants and animals or dead plants and animals. Now, usually fungi break down plants, and you can think about all the mushrooms you see popping out of rotting logs, and bacteria usually break down animal matter. So if you see roadkill on the side of the road, it doesn't usually grow mushrooms out of its head, but it still breaks down, and those are because of the bacteria in that organism's body. Now, if it weren't for these decomposers, all of these dead things would just stay there and they wouldn't actually go away. So they break these complex molecules stored in life forms like complex carbohydrates into simple molecules that can then be reused in the ecosystem. So they're recyclers, especially for the elements carbon and nitrogen. And fungi are pretty cool because fungi don't actually take in materials into their bodies to break them down. Instead, they secrete enzymes, and keep in mind that enzymes are special proteins that speed up reactions. And these enzymes, once outside of the body, can break down this food, and then the mushrooms or the fungi can take in those simple molecules and use them directly. So scientists like to use models to show how energy flows through ecosystems. And there's two models that you'll typically see: food chains and food webs. So take a look at these for just a second, and what do you notice about them? Hopefully you see that there are some organisms pictured, and there are some arrows. And which way do the arrows point? To what is doing the eating or what is being eaten? Hopefully you notice they point to what is doing the eating. In other words, the arrows point to the direction of energy flow. So energy is going from the grass to the grasshopper, from the grasshopper to the mouse, and from the mouse to the owl. Now I hope that you also notice that one of these is a much simpler model than the other. But which one is more accurate when we're trying to show an ecosystem and the relationships between the organisms that live in it? Hopefully you think about the food web, because most organisms don't just get their energy from one source. They have multiple different things that they can eat. So energy travels in one direction, and it does not cycle through ecosystems like matter does. Okay, so we lose energy through trophic levels. And this would explain why you can't just eat something and be fine for the rest of your life. That energy is going to go into fueling your body's life processes, growth and reproduction of cells. It's going to be used to generate heat for the body. Okay, so there's lots of different things that energy is going to go toward, and not all of the energy that an organism takes in is going to be available to the next level. So what would the simplest food chain be? Remember what all food chains start with: producers. And what do all food chains end with? Decomposers. So we have a producer, decomposer. That's the shortest food chain possible. If a plant just dies and it is decomposed by, say, a fungus. Different organisms have different eating habits. And so we have some words that we can use to describe those eating habits. And as we go through these, I want you to think about the trophic levels that these organisms would belong in. So we'll start with the herbivores. Herb means plant. So these are things that eat only producers, only autotrophs or plants. So which trophic level would you put the herbivores in? Hopefully you're thinking primary consumers, because that's the level that's going to feed off of the producers. We have carnivores. Carn means meat, and so carnivores are meat eaters. So which trophic levels would a carnivore belong to? Hopefully you're thinking secondary consumers and above. Could be any of those, but it would not be a primary consumer or a producer. And then we have omnivores, and omni means all. And these are things that are going to eat both plants and animals, or producers and consumers. So what trophic levels would an omnivore have to belong to? Well, hopefully you're thinking it has to eat plants, so it's going to be a primary consumer, and then it could belong to any of the other consumer levels as well, but it would have to belong to the primary consumer and another level. It couldn't just be one or the other. So omnivores eat pretty much anything. And we have some examples of these organisms here. So which one would the black bear fall under? Hopefully you're thinking omnivore. Bears pretty much will eat whatever. They like berries, and they also like to eat fresh meat. What about our rabbit? Hopefully you're thinking about rabbits being herbivores because they nibble on grass. And the shark, this is a great white shark. And great whites are carnivores. They eat only meat. And just to help you remember what carn means, the word carnival is actually derived from the word meat, because back in the day, before we had rides and electricity and all that good stuff, carnivals were actually places where people would go have this big food festival. It was basically a big festival of meats. And I think some of us would still like to see carnivals like that today. We had two models that we use to show how energy flows through ecosystems. Those would be food chains and food webs. And hopefully you remember that food webs would be a more accurate depiction of how energy flows, because pretty much most organisms don't just eat one thing. They have a variety of food sources that they can get their energy from. Now we have another model that's going to show the amount of energy flow between these trophic levels. And keep in mind, we talked about how energy is lost between trophic levels as we use energy for our own life processes. Now, a model is a visual representation that's going to make some feature of the world easier to understand. They're not always fully accurate, but they do allow us to make predictions and test hypotheses and things like that. So energy pyramids are going to be our models for energy flow. And so we can divide this energy pyramid into pretty equal levels in terms of height, but we can see that each box gets smaller and smaller in area as we go up. And this is to represent how much energy is going to be lost at each trophic level. So your primary producers have most of the energy in an ecosystem, and your apex predators, whatever's going to be at the top here, has the least amount of energy in this ecosystem. So feeding relationships here are shown as a chain, and the size of the box again represents the amount of energy that's available. Now the rule is 10% of energy is all that's going to pass to the next trophic level. The other 90% is going to be used for your life processes, and usually generation of some heat there as well. So what does this mean? We have here a 4-level food chain: corn, cows, humans, and then decomposers. Now we've arranged this food chain into a food pyramid. Keep in mind that the size of the box indicates how much energy is available at that trophic level. So let's see if we can label our trophic levels. We have corn, which is a primary producer, it's a plant. And then we have the cow, which is a primary consumer. The human would be a secondary consumer, and our decomposer is a decomposer. So the most available energy is going to be in the corn because it's at the bottom, and the least amount of energy is the decomposer because it's at the top and has the smallest box. So we can think about this in terms of calories, or we can also think about this in terms of biomass. So I want to talk about biomass, or living material. If I start out with 1,000 kilograms of corn, then the corn is going to use most of the energy to support its own life processes. So only about 10% of the energy available in this corn is going to be passed on to the next trophic level. So what that means is if the cow eats this 1,000 kilograms of corn, there's going to be enough energy to support 10% of this biomass that we have in the corn for the cow. So that means we're going to divide by 10, and there will be 100 kilograms of cow meat that we can get from this 1,000 kilograms of corn. Notice we just divided by 10. Drop to 0. Move the decimal one place to the left. All of these things are the same. Okay? So how much energy would we have in the human? All right. If we have this 100 kilograms of cow meat that the human eats, this is going to be enough to support 10 kilograms of human biomass, okay? So the human can eat the cow, and if they eat 100 kilograms of cow, there's enough to gain 10 kilograms of human. So how much decomposer would we get? Well, we're going to divide 10 by 10, and that's going to give us 1 kilogram. So why is this important? Well, maybe you've heard before that it's more efficient for humans to eat plants than it is for us to eat cattle. And the reason for this is because if the human eats the 1,000 kilograms of corn, then there's enough to support 100 kilograms of human. But if we go through the cow, then we have to lose 10% of this energy each time. And so this 1,000 kilograms of corn is only enough to support 10 kilograms of human, where if we ate it directly, then you would have 100 kilograms. So hopefully that makes sense. If you have any questions, feel free to contact me about that. All right, so here we have a little checkpoint, and what I want you to do is take this food chain and convert it into this energy pyramid. So where would you put these organisms? Hopefully you would put the grass at the bottom, that's your producer. You would put your mouse next, that's your primary consumer. Your snake would eat your mouse, so that's your secondary consumer. And your hawk would eat your snake, so that is your tertiary consumer. Now, I've given you a number here. If you add 1.35 times 10 to the 5th kilocalories of energy available at this trophic level, then we need to look at how much energy is going to be available at each trophic level after that. So, I have drawn this out for you. Here is your number, 1.35 times 10 to the 5th kilocalories. Well, this is in scientific notation, and some of you might prefer this in standard notation. So let's go ahead and convert that number. Keep in mind, this is a positive exponent, so this number is going to get bigger. And that means we're going to move this decimal 5 places to the right in order to make this a bigger number. So we would have 135,000 kilocalories of energy available at this trophic level. These numbers are the same. Now keep in mind, 10% of the energy is going to be passed. So here we can just drop a 0. So what would that be? Here we would have 13,500 kilocalories of energy. So what would that be in scientific notation? Well, it's really simple. You just subtract 1 from your exponent. So if you wanted this in scientific notation, it would be 1.35 times 10 to the 4th kilocalories of energy. So how much would you have available for the snake in standard notation? Again, we're dividing by 10. We're dropping a 0. So you would have 1,350 kilocalories, of energy available at the snake's level. So what would that be in scientific notation? Well, again, we're just going to divide by 10 or subtract 1 from your exponent. So you would have 1.35 times 10 to the 3rd kilocalories of energy. And these numbers are the same, they're just written in different formats. So what would be available at the hawk if we're looking at standard notation? Well, we're dividing by 10 or dropping a 0, so that would give you 135 kilocalories of energy. And what would that be in scientific notation? You can just drop one of these exponents, so you would have 1.35 times 10 to the 2nd kilocalories of energy. So hopefully this now makes more sense why I told you earlier that we typically don't have trophic levels that are higher than 4 levels. The energy just simply runs out and there's not enough energy available to support higher trophic levels. Before we move on, I want to think about food webs in one more way. So I want you to think about interactions in this food web, and we'll start with a simple one. If we have this grasshopper eating this grass, and we spray pesticide, and we remove this grasshopper, what's going to happen to our grass population? Well, hopefully you're thinking, well, there's nothing to eat it, so that grass is going to grow and there will be more of it. And that would be correct. But that's pretty simple. What would happen then if we took away the mouse? What would happen to our grass then? Well, let's think backwards. The mouse is eating the grasshopper. And if the mouse isn't there, then that means there's going to be more grasshoppers. So then that should mean that there's going to be less grass because there's more things to eat it. Okay? So let's say that we take away the grasshopper. What would happen to the deer population? Well, if there's no grasshoppers, there's nothing eating this grass besides these deer and rabbits here. So there's more grass to feed these deer and rabbits and to feed their growing population. So you would expect there to be more deer. So I want you to make sure that you can think about interactions in food webs. And as long as you can justify what's happening, you have a good explanation for it, then you should be good to go. So here are my resources. I hope this lecture was informative for you.